Hello,
Hey Juan, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. And you? What's up?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you.
Cool. What have you been up to?
Good question. Trying to stay awake for now.
Good.
Um, Catching up on things today. How about you?
Main thing I'm working on actually is that I've been hitting all sorts of problems with rapid JSON. The JSON parser I've been using for a lot of stuff. So I'm finally finalizing my own and publishing it on GitHub. So it will be this week, hopefully.
Nice. Are
Now we don't
you
have to depend
running
on
all of
any JSON libraries.
Are you running the parsing JSON as a minefield test suite?
Oh, for sure. Yes. It passes everything, every single one, including the optional ones, except two that I'm working on today.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Yes, it should be good.
I remember reading that article when it came out. You'd
It's
think
very
JSON
interesting,
would be
actually.
fairly, like, you'd think JSON would
Yeah,
be simple enough to not have
it is
that sort
not.
of problem. Yeah, like it's more
It
complex
is
than
not.
people
Yeah.
imagine.
The most tricky ones, I think, in my experience, writing all of this is numbers.
Mm.
There are many edge cases with numbers. So JSON is way more strict, for example, with regards of like leading zeros or like leading plus signs, very specific rules for scientific notation as well, and things like that.
Mm.
And also you have the challenge, in comparison with for the entirety of the rest of the JSON grammar, numbers are the ones that you cannot know when a number ends, right?
Mm.
You have to like keep looking ahead. So it also makes that a bit more complicated.
Mm.
But yeah, fun. You should
And
write a JSON parser. Sounds like something to do in your lifetime.
I guess for territories where um delimiters would normally be commas rather than full stops, it gets confusing.
Yeah. Well, it's good. It's 99% done.
That's
And
pretty
then I'm
cool.
porting, a lot of my stuff, on top of that. So yeah, the things I got in touch with one, I think, guy from the JSON Schema community that I think you have been in touch with. He's called Michael something from New York. He was doing lots of research around JSON and has like the very advanced, JSON schema extraction thing from data. So you put, a JSON data
Mm.
set, it will infer a JSON schema. 2012, and it's pretty good actually, with
Oh
some papers
yeah,
around that.
yeah.
So he has been hitting the most obscure issue with, JSON bin pack I've ever seen coming down to rapid JSON. So that was like the end of it for me. I was like getting rid of it.
Hey, listen.
Hello, let me send you the link. You might not have seen it, but I've been playing around with it and it's pretty good actually. There you go.
Thank you.
Hey everyone,
Hello.
got kind of
Hey.
a small group today. I thought I was late, but then there's nobody else here.
There you go. Well, I'll share my screen in the meantime as I'm facilitating this one. We'll see if anybody else joins. Otherwise, maybe 1 minute should probably start. I
Yeah,
don't think there's much, but we'll
last week
see.
was light too, just three of us. Yeah, a different three.
Different three.
Holiday
The magic
season, isn't
number.
it?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, we can start and we'll see if anybody else joins, but we're like 5 minutes in, so I think it might be this group of magic three people. So yeah, so welcome to the JSON Schema Open Community Meeting. For the meeting accessibility, we would like to record the meeting for future reference, and for those who are not able to attend in person, we encourage everybody to challenge any language or behavior that is harmful or not inclusive during this meeting. And we look forward to your participation. So make sure that you mute yourself when not talking. And also, if you do not want these to be uploaded to YouTube, then feel free to either reach out to me or any other of the core members of JSON Schema in this call, and we're gonna take care of that. So for reviewing last meeting items, it seems like we actually don't have any action item from before. So unless anybody wants to comment on anything from the previous meeting, we can jump into the 2 items that we have right now. The first one being by Ben. So it's an update on the issues about the roadmap. So Ben, feel free to take it over.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hey, Greg.
Hello.
Yeah, so I wanted to make sure we have space in each of our calls to gather updates and discuss progress on items related to the roadmap. This last week for me, I've only worked a couple of days and had quite a bit of time off. However, I have been thinking about the contributor license agreement / developer certificate of origin issue that we have open. As a refresh, this is one of the items on the OpenJS Foundation onboarding process, that we must have a CLA or DCO. I've been digging into specifically, firstly, what it would mean and what we would get from it, if anything, and reading around various different opinions to see if it really even makes sense for us, or if we should try and get an exemption. I haven't concluded that. I'm planning to write up my thoughts from last week at some point this week, but I've been following up on a number of different issues that are potentially more important to get moving forward. Anybody else?
Well, all the projects doing, by the way, in terms of the
it's a mix.
DCO and okay.
There are a couple that have it implemented. There are some which have an open issue from like 5 years ago. There's not really any enforcement. That might change. In the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, there has been a recent drive to try and increase compliance with that policy. But yeah, I'm still not really sure it's going to give us the benefits we want given the history of the product. Like, I think it makes sense. It can make sense more for products that are just starting, but for projects that are as long going as us and where we are at this point in time, I'm not sure it makes sense. However, I'm going to write up my thoughts on what I've discovered and read so far, and chat with people here and the OpenJS Foundation and see where we go next with that story.
Yeah, I mean, one comment from me on that, from my time looking at all of those things, one of the key benefits I would give you is that for anybody, for example, contributing to the spec or something like that, or any project in the JSON Schema realm, for example, doing a DCO, and what I guess that and CLI as well, it is very precise on then who owns, that copyright on that. Is like you transfer actually that intellectual property into the project. Otherwise, it might be, a bit in a gray area. So it could give you benefits, like, for example, I don't know, in the future you want to say change the license of the project or something like that. You don't have to, for example, to go back and like have to ask everybody in the team, or everybody has committed into the project, because through that it's actually property of the project at that point in time. So there are some interesting benefits, but I think, as you say, adopting it at this point where like there's probably a lot of people that have not followed that DCO or CLI in the past might also be weird.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues is we know for a fact that we have contributors that we're not able to reach, that are not replying to numerous requests. So we would never be able to get all of the contributors to commit to an IP transfer if that's what the DCO would give us, and able to in order to relicense if we so required to do so. But yeah, that's one of my sort of points that I'll be making in my write-up on that, is even if we did manage to add the policy, we don't have the capacity, or we don't have the ability to retroactively get consent from people that have contributed that aren't responding. So yeah, I'll write that up and then see where that leaves us. Anybody else been working on anything related to the roadmap?
Yeah, the conversion of the spec to Markdown, I think is ready for to be merged. I was supposed to ping you, Ben, last week to get your thumbs up on that, but I wanted to. So everybody else is ready to merge that, but since you're one of the people who regularly contributes to the wording of the spec, wanted to get your sign off on it as well before merging.
Yeah, I'll make sure I have a look at that tomorrow. And I'll give my review on that. Thanks for your work on that.
Other than that, we've just been discussing URIs some more. At this point, I'm concerned that we might be not arguing the same thing, or understand what each other is arguing. Mostly because of Greg's last comment, kind of felt confusing to me. But yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. I realize that what I'm asking for is controversial, but I think what I'm asking for is something that is not restricting anybody else in any way. So I'm hoping that there's room for compromise there.
Jason, there's definitely room for compromise. I don't think that we're getting any compromise from you, is my position on this.
Really?
You've held fast to this position of URIs need to be locatable, and
That's not my position.
I don't see the benefit. I think that's what you need to really show is what's the benefit in doing this, and you have to present it in a way that's not specific to your implementation. I don't think that anybody else sees the benefit of doing all of this. The point one that I made in the opening comment, I've put a note on there saying that I'm backing down on this because I agree with Karen specifically that if anything, this needs to be more strict. That's the arbitrary association between URIs and schemas seems to me to be a required mechanic in order for JSON schema to work.
So that's something that so Austin had worded this in a way in one of his comments that a little bit differently, and I wonder if what he was saying is what you're actually what you actually mean, and not what, and I think you mean something different. So he was saying like there has to be some way, like the implementation has to have some way to map URIs to schemas, which kind of is like, yeah, duh, like what else, like how else could it possibly, work? But but I'm wondering if that's actually what you're saying, and not literally any URI needs to be able to map to any schema. Just that the
What's the
implementation.
difference?
What the difference is like there. So the what Austin was saying, there has to be some way for a URI to become a schema, you know, somehow, right? And it's not, and how you get there is up to the implementation. So if I want to say that you know, an HTTP URI needs to make a network connection, I'm not saying that it does, but if I wanted to write an implementation that did that, that would be allowed. But if I wanted to then map an HTTP URI to a file, I wouldn't like that's not necessarily something that's required of the implementation to do. So that's arbitrary URI to arbitrary schema. But if that's different than assign, you know, the implementation has to have some way of turning a URI into a schema.
I think that second case is just is something that you're overthinking, to be honest. It shouldn't matter that it's in a file. It shouldn't matter whether it's in a database or hard coded or whatever. If the user expects a particular URI to map to that schema wherever it is, the user needs to be able to say, this is the schema that this URI means. And that's arbitrary association.
Right, but I'm saying that that the user doesn't need to have that much power. So it sounds like you're saying the user should have the power to map any URI to any schema, and I'm saying there just has to be some way that URIs get mapped to schemas. Not that users necessarily have control over that mapping, other than ID, $ID. Ben?
Okay. Another thing that you're saying in here, your last large comment against Austin's comment is that it seems very heavy on the use of relative IDs, which is we support, but I don't know that it's something that I see a whole lot. I don't know that I see relative IDs like on Stack Overflow a whole lot.
I'm not talking about relative IDs. In fact, that's worse than absolute IDs. I'm talking about relative references, like $ref.
Right, saying it's the same thing to me. Okay, I take your difference, but it's not something that I see a whole lot. I see references to absolute ID, absolute URIs.
Really? That's
yeah.
I almost never do I see absolute URIs and references. I mean, it's always relative.
The only places I've seen relative references primarily is in the test suite. And that's within the same schema, because we've defined IDs with those relative paths.
But the only time I see relative references being used is when I'm sorry, lost my train of thought. We're talking about relative references.
I think you mean the absolute references.
Right.
You say you didn't see those.
Yeah, the only time there's an absolute reference in a $ref is if it's a different domain than the schema that is making the reference. Otherwise, it's expected that a relative reference is used there.
I think expected is strong.
I would disagree. I've definitely seen that, and that's my actual preferred choice, is to have always use absolute URIs for references, even if the schema has an ID provided. That's actually my preference, because I think it avoids confusion, because people don't know how to do that in their head naturally a lot of the time. So that's always my recommendation, is to use the absolute URIs. Going back to something you were saying earlier, like you don't believe people need the power to ascribe arbitrary IDs with arbitrary schemas. I can say definitely they do, and at scale. I can't remember where this use case came from, but it's stuck in my mind as a good example of someone using schemas offline. I think it was a book processing factory. They use JSON schema. They're provided with schemas from external sources they don't have control over. They have to use them internally without accessing the internet. So they have closed network for the factory stuff. They might have to create artifacts as a result of that. If they're not provided schemas that have IDs in them, but the schemas do have absolute URLs for the references, they need to be able to say, this schema over here is this URI. They need to have that precision to arbitrarily set up a registry of dumb strings to schemas. They can't modify those schemas.
Why can't that be done with relative references?
It's not that it can't. It could be done with relative references, but they don't have control over the schemas. The schemas are updated arbitrarily, and they have to compile that index. They have to compile that registry at runtime. You could argue that's not a great system, but that's the system they have. That's the schemas they're given.
So, I mean, are these schemas coming from different sources? Is that what you're saying?
They're not schemas that they have control over. They're coming from external sources.
Okay.
Jason, if we don't have arbitrary association in the spec, then my feeling is that implementations won't provide that feature. And in order to do any kind of offline validation where you have references that indicate that they should go out to the network, you can't unless the implementation supports arbitrary association between URI and schema. I think this is a necessary thing.
I don't think it's necessary, and I don't think that that not putting it in the spec is going to mean that people aren't going to implement it, especially if you say it's necessary. And if it's necessary, people are going to implement it.
In what way do you think it's not necessary? What's the alternative solution for people that are offline validation?
Well, I mean, that offline doesn't have to be, a problem. Like you can bundle all those things, separately in a place that that you do have online access to download those schemas that you don't have control, and then feed that bundle to the implementation.
I think that takes us to another aspect of this that I think you're trying to tie in that the inclusion of ID is not something that you're not a fan of. And I agree with Austin that that ID allows you to pick up a schema and send it somewhere else, and it stays the same ID, it stays the same reference. If I were to host on JSONeverything.net all of the JSON schema meta schemas, then that doesn't change their URI. It just rehosts them. That's located somewhere else, but the IDs are still the same. And it's very important that the IDs remain the same.
I don't necessarily agree that it's important that they stay the same. What identifies those schemas, what identifies the dialect of those schemas is the vocabulary IDs. So those are the things that need to stay the same. Otherwise, it can
Okay,
come
so
whatever URL.
so let's say that I decided to rehost those files, and for some reason jasonschema.org, it goes away, or it can't be accessed for whatever reason, or we get hacked. I don't know. All of the references to those URIs, if they're using them as locators, all of those references are broken.
All of those things should be cached on an implementation anyway.
How long
So
is
I
it
don't think
cached?
that's
Does it
relevant.
live indefinitely?
What's that?
Oh, does it live indefinitely? Does the cache live indefinitely? I mean, sure, the implementation can hard code that stuff in, but it's not necessary. There's not a requirement that says an implementation must have a copy of the meta schema inside of it.
Yeah, I mean, it could. I mean, this is all implementation details. I mean, it depends on how an implementation wants to, maintain that. I mean, personally, for special cases like those, I would just have them hard coded into a cache. But it's an implementation choice.
Right, but you're not answering my question. So
Sorry.
the target, let's not say the meta schemas, let's say some other well-known schema suddenly isn't available at its location, but it is available somewhere else. So now the user has the option to download it from somewhere else, and then tell the implementation, hey, when you see this ID, here's the schema for that ID.
Yeah. An implementation could absolutely support that, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't. I'm not
saying
sure.
I'm saying that it should, which is slightly different than you not saying it shouldn't.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, you're right. That is the difference we're talking about. And it's interesting that you're saying that I'm being uncompromising when what you're asking for is making what I want to do impossible, where what I'm asking for allows for everybody to do what they want to do. So it doesn't sound like I'm the one that's not willing to compromise here. If I was uncompromising, I would be, insisting that we don't allow arbitrary association at all.
How does this?
That's not what I'm saying.
How does arbitrary association hurt what you're doing? How does it make your life difficult?
Because it's a shortcut, and it's usually a shortcut for people to do things that are more confusing and less natural for the web. I've seen multiple issues in the last few weeks of just people confused about how to associate schemas. Where and two of them where the important, like the issue was just that, you know, that you're getting confused with the IDs. If you just remove them, like all of your problems go away. Excuse me, I need to take a minute and get some water.
All right, I'm confused at how removing ID solves the problem.
Sounds to me like what we were discussing, it's very translatable to HTML and canonical, you know, like meta tags in there. Whereas, you know, with an HTML file, you could rehost it anywhere. They're accessible implicitly by the URI you have used. But then at the same time, you can provide what is a true, you know, URI of the HTML page embedded in the document itself.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm saying is, I think it creates a situation that is more confusing for users and creates more support requirements than if it's just something that's simple, like, you know, it's a file and use relative paths to the file, and like 99% of the time, that's what people need. And it's the most easiest thing for them to understand.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see how many people or how many implementations support, for example, the file protocol. Because I think it is not many, but they do provide often resolvers so that you can deconstruct the URI and do whatever you want with that in order to find the schema that you want.
Yeah, a lot from what I've seen support HTTP. All the JavaScript or Java implementations I've seen support the class path scheme. I know my implementation in AJB support files. But yeah, I think I don't know that file is very commonly supported, but I think that's a shame because that would make things a lot easier for most users if they're just working with files.
There's also no requirement that HTTP is supported yet. Technically, most will recognize an HTTP URI, but then they'll associate it with something that's been registered because that's how we've said to do it.
Yeah, and that's not what I was talking about. I'm talking about actually implementations that make network requests.
Which is something we say don't do.
Yeah, lots of them do anyway.
Can we recap as to where we are in this discussion? Because I'm not completely clear what we're debating about right now, or where we've got to.
There are two issues that we've been debating. The first is arbitrarily associating a URI in a schema, basically allowing the user to say this URI means this schema, and having that as a whatever level requirement of an implementation. An implementation has to be able to do this, or should be able to, or whatever. So that's one thing that we're debating. The other is inclusion of ID and our recommendation for that. So currently the spec has a recommendation that ID is supplied with with the schema. And one of the proposals in this is to just remove the recommendation. It's not to say that it's not removing ID. It's just saying it needs to, we need to remove the recommendation to use it.
I mean, one of the good arguments for the recommendation is also when it's embedded inside another resource, such as the Open API or async API. That's a really good way that you can identify that, hey, this is a JSON schema resource here, and here's its identifier.
That's right.
So
it's necessary for embedding. I do think that there are better ways to bundle schemas than to embed them inside each other, but that's a whole different conversation. Yeah, in this case, we're saying like only use it when you need it, which is in bundling is a case where you would need it.
I do think, you know, I do think your earlier suggestion of if you need to do this, then bundle is a viable alternate solution. But to me, that seems like a bigger overhead in terms of cost to implement and maintain. Because you know that having a registry of this string equals this thing over here, that's a really simple thing, right? That's not a complicated thing to make or maintain. It's just, you know, dumb string equals thing.
Yeah, it does. It is a little bit more complicated to do what I'm thinking. Like I mean, I'm thinking something along the lines of like you have a package manager script like a package JSON that has dependencies, and at some point you do npm install and download all those dependencies, and then they're cached there, and then you just use those cached dependencies instead of going to get them every time you need them. That's the kind of thing I would expect of a registry. So it's like one time download all the things that you need and then use that cache that you pulled from all those for your offline usage.
But if you're doing that at runtime and you don't have runtime internet access, you can't do that initial download if you're offline.
Well, that's what I'm saying. You don't do it while you're online. Like you do it, I mean, just like in a Node application, like you don't download your dependencies on the fly. You download it ahead of time, install your application with those dependencies, and then run offline.
Actually, to your Node.js point, the other project that takes a different approach to this, and it might be also similar to what you're talking about, is Dino. So Dino, what it would do is that you don't download the dependencies on the fly, in advance, npm-like way. But in Dino, if you are referencing any dependency by CRI on the file itself, the first time that you run it, it will fetch everything and it will cache it for future runs. But they also provide another command for you to essentially evaluate your entire source code and fetch them all in advance, kind of supporting both.
Right, and just like there's multiple ways to do it there, I think there's no reason there shouldn't be multiple ways for JSON schema to do it.
So what about the situation, where Greg was talking about, where there is a set of schemas which is no longer accessible at the URI that they're identified with?
Then I mean, this happens with dependency caches as well. I mean, a lot of companies will set up their own I don't know, what do we call it? Registry, I guess. that copies, you know, the latest copies of all the external dependencies, and then uses that in as a more convenient, not convenient, but more reliable option than going out to the actual registry. You see, these are all implementation details that I think, you know, can be done in lots of different ways, and JSON Schema doesn't need to restrict them.
I mean, it's not even a restriction if it's you know, a recommendation, if it's a should. I can't see how it's like a burden to, like, what you're saying is someone's got to go and spin up a whole service and proxy a URL in order to support something that's no longer online, when they have the files locally already and they've got IDs in the files. They just want to load the files into the schema validation software and use those. I mean, that's what I expect from implementations. I want to go, here's my load of schemas, go load those in, and you know, those IDs are the schemas.
That's certainly a reasonable way. It just doesn't have to be the only way.
No, it certainly doesn't have to be the only way, but I definitely feel that's the recommended way. You don't want it going and doing any HTTP requests or any file opens unless you're explicitly doing that in a build step somewhere else, in which case that's completely outside of the scope of the implementation. That should have nothing to do with the implementation. But you have to
load that build, whatever was built, into the implementation somehow. But yeah,
and that's where the being able to load in a registry of this ID equals this schema is what you want in implementations.
I agree, it's a useful feature.
Sorry?
I agree it's a useful feature, just not that it should be required.
It's not required, it's just recommended. It's a should, right? Like, unless a should is unless you have a very good reason not to do so.
Yeah, well, should is a very, very strong you know, you should really do this. But also Greg is arguing that it should become a must.
I mean, I agree, but that's just my expectation of implementations. It would certainly make things a lot easier. Like, the implementation doesn't have to care about a whole load of other things. It just has to be able to load in the registry. If you want to write plugins to, you know, be able to, you know, process a set of schemas and download all the stuff and associate URIs to schemas or any other type of identifiers to schemas beforehand, and then you can shove that registry into the implementation. That reduces a whole lot of work for the implementation, because then it only has to be able to go, this string equals this thing over here. That's all it has to care about. It doesn't have to care about any protocols. It doesn't have to care about making HTTP requests. It doesn't have to care about accessing files, because that's all downstream.
Yeah,
or upstream, I guess.
I agree that it's harder for the implementations to do what I'm the approach that I'm talking about, but I think it's easier for users to understand. So to me, it's making it easier for users, or making it easier for implementers, and my preference is making it easier.
I completely disagree with your supposition there. I think it makes it easier for users and easier for implementers.
Why do you think it makes it easier, Jason? Why do you think it makes it easier for users?
Because I get you know, support requests and see these things all the time, where people are confused about something because of the arbitrary IDs that they're using, instead of just using a relative file reference.
Yeah,
I get no such support requests.
I do see those specific ones.
Slack just today, I think, or was it yesterday?
I do see those specific ones, and I think why we're seeing those is not because people don't understand it, because Like, I think some of them do expect it to be able to access file paths, but if you say like you put the IDs in and then you shove the schemas into the implementation, like if that interface was standard and you pass all the schemas in with their IDs and it knows which ID is which schema, that has always solved the problem with me. And implementations that support it, that's always been a perfectly fine solution that they've perfectly understood. But the problem is that the interface to doing that is not consistent, and it's not the same for many implementations. There's a number of Java implementations where it's terribly documented. And I have to go, you have to build the whole interface yourself rather than having a schema registry structure you can pass into the constructor, which is how I think the good implementations do it. You pass in a schema registry when you initialize whatever it is you initialize or set up. That seems to be the preferred interface to me, which I don't see people asking those questions for those implementations because it like the solution is obvious because the documentation is there. I see people asking these questions when the documentation isn't there or the interface isn't there. That's where I see people asking these questions, and that's why I think it will make it easier for the user, because in the implementations that do have those, I don't see those questions.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. I guess that's just a disagreement. I'm surprised we all see different things. Maybe we see what we want to see. But I mean, I really think that that I'm not asking for much, in that I'm not asking that we change the advice that we give implementers. I'm not asking that we remove any functionality that that already exists in JSON schema. I'm just asking that we open up more possibilities. I feel like that's pretty reasonable.
How does removing this recommendation open up more possibilities? Because it's not restricting you from doing other things.
So a should is not restricting from doing other things. A must would be.
How? This is saying that you have to do this one thing A, and you're saying that you want to do this other thing B, but A doesn't prevent you from also doing B.
I'm not sure what you're saying.
Okay, so if let's say we change this to a must. So this would say that users absolutely must have the ability to associate a URI with a schema arbitrarily. What does that prevent you from doing? What does that make it impossible for you to do?
It prevents me from writing an implementation that that doesn't allow users to arbitrarily assign URIs, forces them to use schemes the way that they're intended to be used, or even allow them to arbitrarily do what they want, but they have to write their own scheme plugin to do that.
Does removing or keeping this requirement open really enforce that? Does
Why wouldn't
arbitrary association a non-requirement really enable people to, or really force people into using schemes correctly? I don't think it does.
That's not the point.
That was your point just now.
It forces me as an implementer to include functionality in my implementation.
Why?
Because it's in the spec and it's a must.
No. If we don't have arbitrary association, I can still support arbitrary association, and I can completely disregard the scheme. So
Right.
my point is that by not having arbitrary association, it doesn't force me into a position that guides my users to using schemes correctly, which is what your point is that you just said.
I'm sorry, say
Not
that again.
not having this as a requirement does not force me into using schemes correctly.
That's right.
That's the premise of your argument that you just stated, is by having this, it's going to force me to use schemes correctly. And
No,
thus force my
it-
users to use scheme correctly.
no. It allows me to write an implementation, but doesn't force you to do the same. That forces, like, my implementation can be written to force users to use schemes properly, but without requiring your implementation to do the same. If it's a must, then I can't write that implementation that forces users to use schemes properly.
I think, if somebody is doing that, they probably don't have the capacity to even understand how to use schemes properly. Like they don't have the bandwidth for doing that. That isn't even a consideration that they would have, and they'd probably just ditch your implementation and go look somewhere else. Like that's the sort of level I imagine people coming in and having those sort of problems.
I agree. In that I've been doing this for 8 years now, and I'm just now starting to like really dig into URIs and understand what the schemes mean and everything. And after 8 years of working directly with URIs, if I'm just now looking at this, I can't expect, especially new users of JSON Schema, to understand enough to be able to do it right. If that's what your implementation is going to force. If you still want to do that, that's your choice.
I mean, I think that's
Yeah,
also
that's my point. It's my choice, right? I mean, if you think that users aren't going to use it, maybe you're right, maybe you're not, but it's still my choice, right?
and I think that's part of the problem, is that the interfaces aren't consistent, and it creates an inconsistent ecosystem for users, is they can't find implementations that are consistent in terms of how to add schemas into a registry which have arbitrary association. And that's it. That's like the base level that I look for in implementations. And I certainly personally want to make that a requirement. I can't, like, what you're describing, you're forcing people to learn more stuff on top of stuff that they probably already don't know. And
I
like,
don't think it's that complicated. I think what we do now is forcing people to learn new stuff on top of what they already know, because they already know how URIs work. They know, like they know that a file URI points to the file system.
I
They
don't
know
think they do. I really don't think they know there's even a file URI. I don't think they know they can do that. I think they just go, oh, it's HTTP. That's just a URI. I think most people, I think most developers that are, out there using schemas to validate API payloads are probably not even really looking at this stuff. And I think people that are developing it, they are largely ignoring any other protocol in the URI.
So forget about that. I think that what people are using are relative URIs. So when you write a node application, you do a require for another file, you use a relative URI. That's a file URI. The user doesn't need to know that it was a file. They just use it like it's a relative URI, and then it just works. That's the
Most
kind of
people probably
that
don't even know that it's a URI. They're just saying, oh, it's a file path.
exactly, and they don't need to know, because all those details are abstracted away. They don't ever have to see file : ever.
And that also makes the assumption that if you move a schema, you're moving all of the references that schema makes relative to your schema. So if you have a schema that makes 5 references, 5 relative references, if you move that schema, it makes the assumption that you're also moving those other files. Whereas if you're using arbitrary association, you can move any one of those files and it still works because you separately went out and you registered those schemas and all of your references work.
Yeah, I think this is less of a problem than you think. I mean, we have this same dynamic in any program that we write, right? If you move a file, then you got to move the references. You got to change all the references to it.
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
normal.
in like HTML, this is why you don't have relative references to your, CSS and JavaScript is because you use the absolute URIs, slash rather than dot anything, because otherwise you end up in hell. Because it's
yeah, and still, if you move stuff, you gotta update that URI. It's a normal part of any application development.
Yeah, but not if it's an absolute URI.
If you change the absolute, if you move the file, the absolute URI changes, and you have to.
Well, that's if you're using a file path association. If you're using some other sort of association where the file itself identifies what it is.
If you have /css/styles.css and you move it to /css dot or /extra styles/css, you have to change the URI declaration in your link element, right?
If you're not bundling them as part of your compilation process, yeah.
So I don't understand how you're saying that you can move that file without having to change the reference to it.
You'd have to change the reference to it somewhere. I was thinking in terms of like classes and stuff. But yeah, jumping around in the analogies probably isn't helpful.
I'm not following this argument. I think I've misunderstood something, but I'm not sure what it is. So I have an appointment, and so I can't stay after 3 here. So have to continue this discussion. We'll have to do it later.
Do we want to record any action item? When I continue the
Right
discussion
now,
or something like that?
Right now, this is point 1 in that discussion. I'm happy to leave it as a should. I'd like to move it up to a must, but I'm happy to leave it as a should. But I don't think it should be downgraded at all or removed.
Yeah, making it a must is a hard no for me. A should is not ideal. I'd rather it say nothing. A must is, or a may is okay. So it sounds like we're at sticking with should.
I think this is one of those issues that needs distilling and potentially writing up a draft decision record so we can get more eyeballs on this. I know it seems ridiculous to have a decision record to change something from a should to a must or to a should to nothing. But we should at least consolidate the arguments for and against in both directions so we can get some clear eyeballs, because I've spent majority of my day reading this. I need to go over it again just to make sure I understand the arguments. We spent a lot of time today discussing it. So yeah, in order to get some eyeballs on this from users and other implementers, we need to consolidate what the arguments are to make that easier for people to digest and feedback. That's my thoughts on how we should approach this now.
Okay.
All right,
Okay.
I got to run. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Talk
Thank
to you
you
later.
all. Bye.
Bye.